Focus fire on their lead ship. We're not giving them a chance to regroup. Captain Zarek Vorn's voice rang out across the bridge, cutting through the tension like a blade. His eyes tracked the chaotic space around him, every movement on the plasma displays spelling out a story of destruction and fleeting hope. The deck beneath him shuddered as another wave of Khor'harr ships tore into the fleet's outer defenses, their jagged hulls covered in pulsating biomechanical growths. The Dominus rocked violently, but the crew was prepared. "Shields holding at 60%, Captain," Lieutenant Grivan Osel reported, his voice steady but edged with urgency. He flicked his fingers across the heads-up display, adjusting the targeting parameters. "They're adapting faster than we expected, Captain. Their weapons are synchronized." "Not fast enough," Vorn growled, barely glancing at Osel. His attention remained locked on the war unfolding in front of them. Thousands of enemy ships, moving as one, an unstoppable wave of destruction. But the Dominus was different. It was humanity's last promise to the galaxy. A force that would never bend, never yield. "Target their main engines. Disable their fleet's coordination. We hit them where it hurts." The low hum of the ship's engines faded as the tactical team keyed in their commands, sending ripples of fire through space. For a moment, the battlefield went quiet, the Khor'harr momentarily stunned as their lead ship lost momentum and spiraled toward the void. The crew exhaled, but only briefly. "We have incoming, 10 seconds, Osel warned. Eyes wide as the Khor'harr retaliated, their ships split into smaller swarms, firing with a ferocity that could melt the hull of any lesser ship. "We need a new strategy, Captain. Their numbers are overwhelming." "Then we take away their numbers." Vorn's voice was calm, though the weight of the galaxy's fate pressed on him like a storm cloud. "Deploy all drones. Set a perimeter around the Dominus. Let them come to us." The display flashed as hundreds of sleek, autonomous drones ejected from the Dominus. They moved in tight formations, a deadly net that surrounded the massive warship. Each drone, equipped with energy shields and laser-guided projectiles, was a piece of an intricate plan designed not just to fight, but to overwhelm the enemy through sheer force of will and firepower. As they dispersed into the black void, their blinding trails left the faintest marks on the darkness, a clear sign of humanity's unyielding presence. But the swarm was far from intimidated. As the Khor'harr ships adjusted their attack vectors, they lashed out with organic tendrils of energy, arcs of crackling plasma flying toward the Dominus. Vorn watched the plasma strikes ripple across the displays, registering the damage in cold silence. A single strike hit their starboard shields, shaking the ship with a reverberating thud that could be felt in the pit of his stomach. "Shields at 45% and holding," Osel reported, his fingers dancing over the console. "They're sending out their flagship. Looks like they're pulling out all the stops." Vorn's jaw clenched. The flagship was a massive living vessel, the size of a small moon, its tendrils and hulls warping in ways that defied logic. The Khor'harr had evolved, and so had their strategy. This ship wasn't just another weapon. It was the heart of their swarm, the nerve center of their operation. If it fell, the Khor'harr's unity would crumble. "Track its trajectory. We're going to end this now." Vorn's voice was a low, calm threat as he adjusted the course of the Dominus. His crew, loyal and disciplined, reacted immediately. The massive Khor'harr flagship loomed larger on the tactical screen. Vorn's fingers curled into a fist. This was no longer a battle for survival. It was a battle for dominance, and humanity's return had come to remind the galaxy what it had forgotten. Humanity's power was relentless, strategic, and unforgiving. "Prepare the main cannon," Vorn ordered, his voice icy. "We're not letting them reach the heart of the coalition." Osel hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes flicking to Vorn, but he quickly nodded, understanding the gravity of the decision. This wasn't just a matter of saving lives. It was about sending a message. Humanity had returned, and the galaxy would never be the same. The hum of the Dominus's main cannon built in intensity, a deep, throbbing pulse that seemed to shake the ship itself. "Ready?" Osel confirmed, his hands moving swiftly over the console. "Fire," Vorn commanded. A beam of energy erupted from the Dominus, a streak of light so powerful that it seemed to tear the fabric of space itself. The Khor'harr flagship was obliterated in an instant, its once imposing form disintegrating under the force of the shot. The explosion rippled outward, sending shockwaves through the nearby enemy vessels. For a brief moment, there was silence, and then the Khor'harr responded. "Deploy the secondary systems! Now!" Vorn barked. The Dominus shook as the drones formed an even tighter perimeter around the ship, their weapons lighting up in response to the Khor'harr's retaliatory strike. Vorn gripped the armrests of his chair as his crew worked in perfect synchrony, the Dominus moving as one, a powerful force designed to strike, not to wait. Explosions rocked the space around them, but the Dominus did not flinch. Its hull absorbed the impacts, and its weapon systems powered up once more. The Khor'harr had underestimated the might of humanity, and now they would pay the price. As the Dominus rained fire upon the swarm, Vorn's mind raced, not just through the present battle, but what came next. This was merely the beginning. The Dominus had just shown the galaxy that humanity would not be silenced, and it would not bend to any force, no matter how great. The Khor'harr flagship, once a looming titan of destruction, disintegrated into a cloud of debris, its remains scattering like ashes in the void. The Dominus held its ground, surrounded by the scattered remnants of the swarm, its crew locked in tense anticipation. For a heartbeat, the battlefield fell eerily silent, save for the soft, rhythmic pulse of the ship's internal systems, a stark contrast to the chaos that had preceded it. "Report," Captain Vorn's voice sliced through the silence, steady, unwavering. "Flagship neutralized, Captain," Lieutenant Osel replied, his hand steady on the heads-up display. "But the swarm's not done yet. They're regrouping." Vorn's eyes never left the laser plasma display in front of him, the faint glow reflecting in his hard, calculating eyes. He knew they hadn't won. Not yet. The Khor'harr had fought with a vicious intelligence, and even in their defeat they had learned. They'll adapt. They always do. Just as the words left his mouth, a new anomaly appeared on the edge of the battlefield, something that didn't belong. The sensors, still humming with data from the earlier engagement, buzzed with an unfamiliar warning. The readings were unclear, fluctuating wildly. The atmosphere in the bridge shifted from victorious to tense in an instant. "What is that?" Osel muttered, his voice betraying a rare note of uncertainty. His fingers flew across the console, trying to analyze the anomaly, but the data seemed to slip through the ship's systems like water through a sieve. No identification. Nothing we've seen before. Vorn narrowed his eyes, his instincts flaring. We're not alone. The anomaly, a strange ripple in the fabric of space-time, began to grow larger. It pulsed, a faint shimmer that vibrated with an unnatural energy. In the corner of his vision, Vorn noticed the reactions of the crew, their eyes glued to the laser plasma displays, their breath shallow. Even the hum of the ship seemed to fade under the weight of the unknown. "Stand by," Vorn ordered, his voice tight with the pressure of the situation. "We don't know what we're dealing with." A moment later, the rippling disturbance tore open like a wound in the universe, and from within the tear, something massive emerged, so massive that it blocked out the distant stars, casting a dark shadow across the battlefield. The Dominus shuddered violently as the enormous shape unfolded, its surface glistening with an otherworldly sheen. The ship's contours were sleek and angular, sharp lines of what appeared to be both metal and organic material, something twisted, alien yet hauntingly familiar. A gasp rippled through the crew. Osel's face turned pale as he scrambled for more readings. It's a ship, but it's unlike anything we've ever seen, not one of theirs, not one of ours." Vorn stood up, his gaze fixed on the alien vessel, his mind racing with possibilities. "Hold fire. Let's see what it does." The massive warship moved forward slowly at first, its movements deliberate. Despite its size, it seemed to glide effortlessly, a perfect harmony between technology and biology. The Dominus crew exchanged uneasy glances, the sense of uncertainty creeping through the air. What was this ship, and why was it here? "Captain, we're receiving a transmission," Osel said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. It's human? Vorn's heart skipped a beat. He had never heard a voice so steady in the face of impending destruction. The voice crackled through the speakers, cold and composed, as if the battle unfolding was nothing more than a formality. This is the Aegis, a human warship. Designation Aegis-class dreadnought. We are entering the engagement zone. Advise all vessels to maintain a minimum distance of 10,000 kilometers from our position. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and the silence that followed was heavy with disbelief. The ship's designation echoed in Vorn's mind. Aegis, the name of a long-lost class of warships, thought to have vanished centuries ago. The galaxy had moved on. Humanity had fallen into the annals of history, their wars and empires forgotten. And yet, here was proof that they had survived, that they had returned. Impossible, Osel breathed, his voice a whisper. The humans, they vanished after the Great War. Their systems became dead zones. Their colonies were wiped out. Vorn's mind raced. There were legends, whispers in the darkest corners of the galaxy about humanity's destructive power. But those were stories told by survivors, stories exaggerated to explain the unimaginable. Yet now here they were, the Aegis, a warship that had defied all expectations, and it was standing between the Khor'harr and their goal. What do we do, Captain? Osel's voice was thick with uncertainty. Vorn's voice remained calm, but his hands clenched at the sides of his chair. We wait. Let's see what kind of hell they bring. As if on cue, the Khor'harr began to move. The first wave of ships, their jagged bodies and deadly appendages pointed toward the new threat, surged forward. They had encountered the Dominus's firepower. Now they would face humanity's deadly legacy. The Aegis didn't flinch. It simply advanced, the power of its weapons building in the calm before the storm. The Dominus watched as the human warship unleashed its first salvo, a volley of energy beams that streaked across the battlefield with terrifying accuracy. The Khor'harr ships, fast and vicious, were no match for the overwhelming firepower. Each blast hit its target with devastating effect, sending entire ships spinning into the void, their organic mass unraveling under the force. "By the stars!" Osel whispered, his eyes wide as the battle raged on. They're unstoppable. Vorn's eyes remained fixed on the unfolding scene, but his mind was elsewhere. This was not just a battle, it was a declaration. Humanity had returned, and they were here not to reclaim their place in the galaxy, but to dominate it. The Aegis moved like a phantom through the battlefield, cutting through the swarm's ranks without hesitation, without mercy. As the Khor'harr regrouped and shifted their tactics, the human ship continued its advance, firing with a cold, mechanical precision that seemed to warp space itself. The Khor'harr hesitation grew more evident, their attacks disjointed, unsure. Something deep in their instinctive minds told them that this battle was different, and yet they pressed forward. Vorn's pulse quickened as he observed the actions of the human warship. There was something chilling about the way it fought. There was no emotion in its attacks, no mercy, just the cold, calculated efficiency of a species that had been forged in conflict. "Prepare for another assault," Vorn ordered, his voice steady but full of anticipation. "We're not sitting this one out." The mystery had deepened. The Khor'harr flagship disintegrated into a mass of glowing fragments, the debris drifting like lifeless stars in the cold vacuum of space. The Aegis stood tall, a silent predator, its weapons still crackling with energy from the recent assault. But the battlefield was far from still. Khor'harr bioships, undeterred by the loss of their command center, regrouped in a deadly, coordinated swarm. Their organic forms rippled in the dark void, each ship now adapting, each moment filled with the threat of something worse coming. The Dominus and the Aegis were the last bastions of the coalition, holding a fragile line in space that stretched thin across the stars. The sense of urgency was thick in the air, the only sounds in the bridge the mechanical clicks of the crew working their stations. A low, sharp beep sounded from the display in front of Captain Vorn. He didn't need to look at Osel to know what it meant. "They're adapting faster than expected," Osel's voice cracked through the tension. his face glowing from the pulsing red light of the laser plasma displays. His eyes flicked between the console and the incoming enemy forces. The Khor'harr are sending out a new wave. Larger, more aggressive. Vorn took a slow breath, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the console. What do we know about their new tactics? Their ships have synced, Osel said, pointing at the flashing lines on the heads-up display. Each formation is strategically placed, covering the others. They're not just throwing everything at us blindly this time. Vorn's gaze darkened, his mind already working through the options. The enemy wasn't just a mindless swarm. They were learning, evolving, and that would be their downfall. We'll force them to take a different approach, he muttered, his voice low and dangerous. Captain, we need to consider backup, Osel warned, his hands shaking slightly. We've already lost too much ground. The Aegis can't hold the line forever. Vorn turned his chair slightly, his eyes never leaving the laser plasma display. We're not asking for backup, Lieutenant. We're making the backup. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now, like a blade about to cut. We need to isolate their command structure, cut off the head. As Vorn spoke, the Dominus shuddered under another barrage of plasma fire. The ship's shields flared, absorbing the hit with a growl of energy. The sound of it reverberated through the walls, vibrating in Vorn's bones. His crew, silent and focused, moved in perfect synchronicity, anticipating his every command. Full power to the starboard side, Vorn barked. We're breaking their formation. The Dominus's engines hummed in response, but it wasn't the engines that made Vorn's heart race. It was the feeling of command, the weight of the decision, the knowledge that the galaxy's fate hung in the balance with each passing second. Osel's voice came again, more urgent this time. They've launched a new type of missile. It's too fast. I can't get a lock. Vorn's eyes narrowed as the new threat appeared on the display. Missiles, bright and fast, streaking toward them like a swarm of angry wasps. They were unlike anything the Dominus had faced before. These were designed to move with terrifying speed, likely a new Khor'harr adaptation. The missiles weren't just fast, they were erratic, nearly impossible to predict. Deploy countermeasures, Vorn ordered sharply. Move the drones to intercept them, now. The drones, sleek and almost invisible in the dark, shot out from the Dominus like the fangs of a predator lunging at its prey. The kinetic force of the missiles met their shields with thunderous booms that rattled the Dominus. The crew felt it, a deep tremor like the ship was going to split apart. The plasma displays flashed, updating with each hit. But still, the missiles were relentless. They kept coming, adapting, responding to every countermeasure the ship threw at them. Get us a clean shot, Vorn snapped, his voice low and deadly. Osel's fingers danced over the controls. Recalculating trajectory. Captain, this is going to take longer than we thought. The swarm's too close. Vorn's jaw tightened. He wasn't about to back down. Then we make the shot ourselves. He stood, his tall frame looming over the console, a quiet force of will. Lieutenant, send a direct feed to the Aegis. We're going to need their firepower to break this. Osel hesitated only for a moment before tapping the command. Channel open, Captain. Captain Venn, Vorn's voice came over the secure line, cold and commanding. We need you to lay down fire to clear the path. We'll take care of the rest. The voice that answered was steady, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Captain Vorn, we've been tracking your movements. I assume you're asking for help? Vorn's response was immediate. Not help, a strike. We need your firepower to take out their flagship. We'll handle the swarm. You focus on the head. The silence that followed was heavy, but then Captain Venn's voice returned, as sharp as ever. Understood. Coordinating fire now. Hold steady. The Aegis fired, and the blast that followed was unlike anything Vorn had seen before, raw energy streaking across the space between the two ships, tearing through the Khor'harr's defenses like paper. The sound of the explosion was deafening, despite the fact that sound didn't exist in the vacuum of space. The Dominus felt it all the same, the violent shaking of the hull as the Aegis's fire connected. Direct hit. They're pulling back, Osel said, his eyes wide. Their formation is starting to break. Vorn allowed himself a small breath. They were making progress. The Khor'harr flagship was retreating, but it wasn't over. The rest of the swarm was still pressing in from all sides, and they had only moments before the next wave descended upon them. "They won't stop," Vorn said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "But we will make them." The Dominus moved forward, its weapons lighting up once again. The feeling of control surged through Vorn, grounding him in the chaos of battle. His crew was performing flawlessly, each officer working in perfect harmony with one another. They weren't just soldiers. They were a single entity, bound together by the will to survive. "All systems go," Osel reported, his voice steady once again. "The swarm is faltering, but there's another wave incoming, bigger, faster." Vorn looked out at the laser plasma display once more, watching as the enemy pressed forward. This time, however, they weren't just attacking. They were running. "They're scared," Vorn murmured. "It's not just us they're fighting anymore." And with that, the battle shifted. The Khor'harr were no longer the unstoppable force they had once seemed. They were retreating, adapting, unsure. The silence in the bridge was deafening, broken only by the sharp tapping of Lieutenant Osel's fingers against the control panel. His eyes flicked across the heads-up display, tracking the Khor'harr's movements. But his mind was elsewhere, focused on the bigger picture. The Dominus had delivered a decisive blow, but the Khor'harr weren't finished. Their retreat was just a brief pause, and the calm before the next storm was never a comfort. "Incoming, Captain." Osel's voice cut through the stillness, his tone grim. "The next wave is here." Vorn didn't need to see the display to know what was coming. He could feel it in the way the Dominus pulsed beneath his feet, the anticipation building in the pit of his stomach. He had led his crew through chaos before, but this was different. The enemy was relentless in its pursuit, and every move they made was faster, more calculated. This was no longer a simple war. It was a test of endurance. "Adjust course," Vorn barked, his voice as sharp as ever. "We're going to give them a different target this time." Osel's fingers moved fluidly across the console, rerouting the ship's path. The Dominus pivoted in space, a sharp turn that sent a ripple of energy through the ship. The Khor'harr ships, moving like clockwork, began to form their new offensive strategy, surrounding them from all sides. The swarm, larger than before, was closing in like a net drawing tighter around its prey. "Drones are in position," Osel reported, his voice steady but tinged with anxiety. "We have seconds before they're within range." Vorn's eyes scanned the display, his mind racing. The Khor'harr were adaptable, always changing, always learning. Their tactics were becoming more advanced, but he had to outthink them, stay a step ahead. This wasn't a matter of brute force. This was about disrupting their rhythm, breaking their flow. "Launch decoys," Vorn commanded. "We need them to think they're winning. Let them get close." Osel's hands were swift as he activated the decoy units, small drones, indistinguishable from the Dominus in terms of size and signature, shot out in multiple directions, mimicking the ship's movements. The Khor'harr fleet fell for it, separating to engage the decoys, their focus now divided. The swarm's momentum faltered for a moment, confusion setting in. "Now," Vorn muttered under his breath. "So." With calculated precision, the Dominus unleashed a barrage of missiles. They tore through the space between them, arcing toward the Khor'harr's flanks. The missiles, equipped with advanced targeting algorithms, wove their way through the chaotic mass of ships, guided by the Dominus's AI. They hit their targets with brutal efficiency. Explosions blossomed in the void, sending debris spinning off into the dark. But even as their forces faltered, the Khor'harr adapted. Their ships reorganized, shifting rapidly to counter the new threat. It was too much, too many. Vorn clenched his jaw as he watched them. No matter how many they cut down, more appeared to take their place. 100 ships became 1,000. 1,000 became 10,000. "We can't keep this up, Captain," Osel said quietly, his voice laced with frustration. "We're draining resources faster than we can replace them." Vorn's gaze remained fixed, unfazed. "Then we won't replace them. We'll make them regret coming after us." He turned to his crew, meeting each of their eyes. The mission had shifted. It wasn't just about stopping the Khor'harr anymore. It was about teaching them that their aggression had consequences. The next step wasn't retreat or defensive tactics. It was offense. It was retribution. "Prepare to engage their command vessel," Vorn said, the words falling from his mouth like a quiet death sentence. "This ends now." The heads-up display flickered as new data flooded in. The Khor'harr's flagship, though still a formidable presence, was now showing signs of weakness. Their earlier movements had exposed small gaps in their defenses, gaps that the Dominus could exploit. "Full power to the forward weapons," Vorn ordered, his voice steady and calculated. "Engage at point-blank range. We'll punch through." "Understood," Ocel replied, his voice filled with resolve. The Dominus surged forward, its engines roaring as it tore through the void, sending shockwaves of force through the emptiness. The Khor'harr flagship loomed large on the display, a monstrous, shifting thing covered in jagged spines and organic mass. The Dominus was closing in, fast. The drones, now having served their purpose, fell into defensive positions, watching for any new threats. Vorn's gaze locked onto the approaching target. The battlefield had become a deadly dance, each move and counter-move a step closer to total annihilation. The Khor'harr were relentless, but humanity's wrath was swift. The moment the Dominus closed to within range, Vorn spoke the final words. "Fire." The Dominus unleashed its full fury. Beams of concentrated energy erupted from its weapons, streaking through the darkness with brutal force. The Khor'harr flagship's shields flared brightly, but they were no match for the sheer power of humanity's weaponry. The flagship's defenses cracked, the ship itself groaning under the assault. It fought back, launching its own volley of energy bolts in an attempt to break the Dominus's charge. But the Dominus was relentless, cutting through every attack with deadly precision. With a final strike, the flagship exploded. The shockwave tore through the space around it, sending smaller Khor'harr vessels tumbling through the void, their once formidable unity now in disarray. Vorn watched the display, his chest rising and falling slowly as he allowed himself a single moment of satisfaction. The swarm was faltering. Their command had fallen, and with it, their will to fight. But as the Khor'harr began to retreat, something strange happened. A new formation emerged from the chaos, one that hadn't been seen before. It wasn't a single ship. It was an entire fleet, pulling together into a tight, compact unit. It was as if they were preparing for something more, something bigger. Ocel looked up from his console, his face pale. "Captain, I don't like this." Vorn's brow furrowed. He leaned forward, analyzing the display. There was no time to regroup, no time for hesitation. The Khor'harr weren't just retreating, they were preparing for their next assault. This wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. "Get ready," Vorn said quietly, the weight of his words settling over the bridge like a storm cloud. "We're about to face something they've never thrown at us before." The Dominus didn't flinch. It stood tall, its weapons primed and ready. Humanity had already made its mark. Now they were about to face the true test. And in that moment, Vorn knew that the galaxy was about to see what humanity could do when backed into a corner. The Dominus stood in the center of the battlefield, the scars of combat etched deep across its hull. Around it, the Khor'harr forces were disassembling, chaotic, retreating, and scattered. Their final fleet was nothing like the organized terror they had unleashed earlier. They had turned into something else, disoriented, lost without their leaders, a fractured swarm now desperately trying to regroup. But the Dominus wasn't here to let them escape. "Captain, their movements are erratic," Ocel said, his voice strained but focused as he read the data flowing through the laser plasma displays. "They're splitting up, trying to make a run for it." Vorn's eyes flicked across the command screen, his jaw clenched. They had torn apart the heart of the Khor'harr's will, but now there was a new wave of determination rising in him. The Khor'harr were in disarray, but their fight wasn't over. Neither was his. "They've learned to fear us," Vorn muttered. The realization struck him with a brutal finality. The Dominus had become a living weapon, humanity's answer to the galaxy's bloodthirsty empires. The fear, the devastation, the Khor'harr hadn't counted on a force that would not relent. What's their next move? Ocel asked, watching Vorn carefully. They're desperate, Vorn said, his voice steady. And they'll fight until the very end. They have no choice. The Dominus shook again as another salvo of missiles rocketed towards them. But this time Vorn was ready. The ship moved, not with the uncertainty of past battles, but with the unshakable rhythm of one who had already conquered. Deploy the last of the drones. Keep them from escaping. The drones launched from the Dominus like a swarm of insects, their sleek forms blending with the chaos. The Khor'harr were still closing in, relentless in their pursuit, but humanity's fury was too great to deny. The drone fleet split, a complex formation designed to corral the Khor'harr forces into a smaller, more vulnerable area. Drones engaged, Ocel reported, his voice now carrying a tone of certainty. They're too close now. We've got them where we want them, Captain. The next moments were a blur, a sequence of attacks, defenses, calculated responses. The Khor'harr flagship, though crippled, was still fighting, still trying to push forward, but the Dominus was relentless. The next wave of drones hit with devastating precision, their strikes cutting through the enemy fleet's remains, leaving nothing behind but debris. Vorn watched the last of the Khor'harr ships disappear into the dark void, swallowed by the crushing power of their adversary. A soft breath escaped him, but his gaze never left the screens. This was a moment of victory, yes, but not one that allowed for celebration. Captain, Ocel spoke, his voice hesitant. Their fleet's done. We've shattered their command. Vorn didn't speak immediately, his mind still processing the scale of it. He could feel the weight of his next words like a stone in his chest. But he knew that the truth of their victory wasn't something to be ignored. We've broken them, he said finally, his voice cutting through the tension. But this battle isn't over. There was a pause before Ocel replied, quieter this time. What do you mean, Captain? Vorn turned from the display, meeting Ocel's gaze with quiet intensity. They didn't come here to conquer us. The Khor'harr came to prove something, to show the galaxy their strength. Now that they've been shattered, they'll send a message, and we'll be the ones who have to carry it forward. Vorn wasn't just talking about the fight. He was talking about what came next. The realization that this wasn't just another war to win. It was the defining moment. This battle, this victory, had proven something. Humanity wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. Humanity was fighting for the future. Ocel nodded slowly, processing the weight of Vorn's words. Then we make sure they never forget what happened here. There was an undeniable shift in the air as the Dominus took up its position in the center of the now quiet battlefield. The Khor'harr were retreating, their will broken, but there was no triumph in Vorn's stance. Only resolve. Open a channel to the fleet, Vorn ordered. His voice rang out with finality, each word carrying the heavy truth of what he was about to say. The channel crackled to life, and Vorn spoke clearly, his words sending shockwaves across every vessel in the coalition. This is Captain Zarek Vorn of the Dominus. The battle is over, but the war we face will be nothing like you've ever known. Humanity has returned, and we don't intend to be forgotten again. The silence that followed was thick, as if every ship in the fleet was holding its breath. Vorn's next words struck like a hammer. We've proven what we can do when we fight with purpose. Now we will lead. Humanity stands at the edge of a new era, and the galaxy will tremble before us, not because of what we've done, but because of what we will do. This war has only just begun. There was a moment of stillness before the comms were filled with a murmur of acknowledgement. The Dominus had delivered its message, not just through firepower, but through an undeniable truth. Humanity was no longer a relic of the past. They were the force to be reckoned with. Vorn turned from the display, his heart pounding in his chest, but his mind clear. The Dominus had cut through the enemy like a blade through cloth, and now, with the Khor'harr retreating into the depths, the galaxy could see humanity's resolve. Prepare for departure, Vorn ordered. We have work to do. The crew moved with a precision that mirrored their captain's intentions. The Dominus had led the charge, and now it was time for humanity to claim its place. As the ship slowly pulled away from the battlefield, leaving the smoldering remains of the Khor'harr forces behind. Captain Zarek Vorn allowed himself one final thought. They had come back, not as saviors, not as conquerors, but as something new, something unstoppable. And in that moment, he knew one thing for certain. The galaxy would never forget the day a human warship entered the fight. Humanity's return was no longer a myth.